Right in the heart of the Indian subcontinent, there's a river that has shaped civilizations for millennia. But if you look closely at the geological record, there's a deep, profound mystery, a secret that suggests this incredible river might not be a work of nature at all. It might just be the result of one of the most staggering feats of ancient engineering ever attempted.
It sounds like a trick question, right? Something out of a myth. But what if it wasn't a myth? What if a civilization pushed right to the very edge of extinction had no choice but to figure out the answer? So let's go back, thousands of years ago. We're looking at an entire ecosystem in total collapse. The great northern plains of India, which were once these incredibly fertile lands, were turning to dust. The lifeblood of the whole region was just gone. And this wasn't some slow decline. No. Geologists can see it right there in the layers of sediment. We're talking about a catastrophic, system-wide collapse. The rivers dried up, the monsoons just stopped coming, and whole towns were basically swallowed by the desert. It was a full-blown environmental apocalypse. And then, something impossible happens. The water comes back. But when scientists look at the evidence, something is very, very strange. This wasn't a natural flood. It wasn't a climate shift. The data points to a sudden, massive, but somehow controlled flow of water. It looks less like a river that returned and more like a river that was, well, built.
Okay, so this is the central paradox. How does a river system this enormous just appear, almost out of nowhere, in the geological timeline? This is where our scientific detective story really kicks into gear. The evidence is a huge contradiction. On one hand, the wider geology tells a story of slow desertification, right? Rivers drying up bit by bit over ages. But then, you look at the riverbed itself, and the sediment layers tell a completely different story, one of a sudden, violent shift. The kind of evidence you'd only see from a massive, sustained deluge that literally remade the landscape in a geological blink of an eye.
So with their world falling apart, a desperate ruler decided to launch one of the most ambitious scientific missions of the ancient world. The goal was simple, but huge. Find the source of the water and drag it back to the plains, whatever it took. They started out with so much hope. They surveyed the dying plains. They began this absolutely Herculean task of carving channels through the Himalayan foothills. But the higher they went, the more they realized what they were up against. The mountains were just brutal. The terrain, the weather, it was unforgiving. And the whole massive project just completely fell apart, a total collapse.
So years go by. That failed expedition becomes this cautionary tale. But then, one lone investigator decides to retrace their steps. Only this time, they weren't looking at it like an engineer. They were looking at it like a scientist, trying to understand the fundamental problem. And after studying the glacial sources high in the mountains, this investigator has a revolutionary insight. The water hadn't vanished at all. In fact, there was tons of it. The problem was, it was too violent. The Himalayan snowmelt came down in these furious, destructive torrents that just tore the land apart. So the problem wasn't a lack of water, it was a crisis of control.
I mean, think about the solution that implies. You'd have to capture that raging torrent at its source and then somehow gently guide it for hundreds of kilometers. It would take a whole new kind of leader, someone who was part scientist, part diplomat, and part master engineer to even dream of attempting it.
And this was not a quick fix. An entire generation tried and failed. And then another one tried and failed. The problem was just that immense. It actually took a third generation and a visionary new leader who had spent his life studying the failures of his ancestors to finally come up with a plan that might actually work.
And this new leader's approach was completely different. He spent years, maybe decades, doing what we would today call rigorous scientific fieldwork. We're talking geological surveys, studying the properties of Himalayan rock, analyzing seasonal snowmelt patterns, and even undertaking diplomatic missions to the tribes living in the mountains. This was patient, meticulous, long-term science.
And what they pulled off next, well, it's honestly one of the greatest feats of hydrological engineering in the history of humankind. The brilliant part was, the plan wasn't to fight the mountains, it was to use the mountains themselves as the main tool.
The design was just genius. First, they captured the violent meltwater in huge, natural, high-altitude basins. Second, they used existing rock formations as these giant natural locks to break the water's incredible force. Third, they released it slowly, gently, down a series of terraced, man-made channels. And finally, once the flow was tamed, they split it into 7 distinct streams to create a massive irrigation network for the plains below. The engineered river finally reached the plains, and that barren, dead land, it drank it all in. The soil came back to life, crops flourished, an entire civilization that was on the absolute brink of disappearing was reborn.
It is an incredible story of science, of determination, of environmental engineering. But you know, the most astonishing part of this entire reconstruction isn't how the river was built. It's where we found the blueprint. Because this whole sequence of events we just laid out, the crisis, the failures, the scientific breakthrough, this is not the story of some 20th century mega project. And it's not even a forgotten chapter from some dusty history book, pieced together from a few scattered archaeological digs.
What we've just described is something else entirely. It's the scientific and engineering blueprint that was preserved perfectly inside one of humanity's oldest and most sacred stories. It's a memory passed down for thousands of years.
This entire engineering saga is a direct, technical reconstruction of events described in the ancient Indian epic, the Ramayana. Specifically, it's the story of the descent of the river Ganga. This isn't just a story, it's a memory, preserved in a narrative that's been told for well over 10,000 years.
And suddenly, once you know that, all the anonymous figures from our scientific story snap into focus. That massive doomed expedition, that was the 60,000 sons of King Sagara. The lone investigator who found the real problem, that was his grandson Anshuman. And the visionary engineer, the one who spent generations in what the myth calls austerities, but what looks a lot like scientific research, that was the great King Bhagaratha. And the river he brought down was the goddess Ganga herself.
So think about what this means. We're looking at a feat of human engineering so vast, so world-changing, that over thousands of years, the memory of how it was built was preserved, not as a technical manual, but as a divine myth. A river literally built by human hands, but remembered as a gift from heaven. And that just has to leave you with a pretty profound question, doesn't it? If a story this complex, full of geology, hydrological engineering, and generational struggle, is sitting right there inside one myth, what other incredible histories of science and human achievement are just waiting to be rediscovered in our most ancient stories?
But here's the big question, right? Is that all it is? Just a really compelling story? Or can we become geological detectives and actually find evidence for this colossal event buried deep under the plains of India? Okay, let's dive in and see what we can find. All right, so to find our clues, we first need to understand the scene of the crime, so to speak. And our scene, well, it's the entire Ganga Himalaya system during a time of incredible, you might even say violent change. We're talking about the end of the last ice age, and you gotta understand, this wasn't some gentle, slow warming. It was a full-blown hydrological crisis. Glaciers were in retreat, just unleashing these massive surges of meltwater. The monsoon, the very lifeblood of the subcontinent, it was completely erratic. And the rivers? Oh, they were totally unstable, carving new paths, abandoning old ones, sometimes disappearing overnight. It was, for all intents and purposes, a world in chaos. So in a landscape that's changing so epically, how in the world do you find the footprint of a single river? One that was maybe, just maybe, guided by human hands? Well, you have to learn how to see ghosts. The first tool in our detective kit is this idea of a paleo-channel. The easiest way to think about it is like a river fossil. It's the path an ancient river once carved, but it's now totally buried under thousands of years of dirt and sediment. Scientists can actually find these ghost rivers using things like remote sensing and drilling. But, you know, just finding a ghost river isn't enough. We need to know when it was alive. And that's where this absolutely brilliant technique comes in, optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. It's basically a geological clock. A scientist can take a single grain of sand from a deep buried riverbed and measure the last time that grain of sand saw the sun. It's amazing. It gives us a precise date, telling us almost exactly when that river was flowing and when it got buried. And when you put these tools to work, wow, the picture that emerges from beneath the plains is just fascinating. We see these huge networks of ghost rivers. Some are unusually straight for tens of kilometers, almost like they were engineered. Others just stop, abruptly, like the water was suddenly turned off. And that OSL dating, it puts these dramatic river deaths right in that window of chaos, between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago. What the evidence really shows is that the modern Ganga wasn't a sure thing. It was just one of several possible paths the water could have taken. And I want to be super clear here, this isn't some fringe theory. This is the result of decades of painstaking fieldwork by teams of top geologists and scientists. We're talking pioneers like Sinha, Geosan, Clifton Valdea, who have drilled cores, analyzed satellite data, and literally mapped the hidden history of this entire river system piece by piece. Okay, but this leads to a huge question. I mean, even in a time of total chaos, how could ancient people possibly hope to move a river that's fed by the Himalayas? The scale just seems impossible. Unless you know exactly where to push. It turns out this is possible because nature itself provides its own leverage points, sort of like cheat codes. Way up in the mountains, you have these glacial lakes held back by natural dams, often with just a narrow little outlet. Then, at the foothills, the rivers spread out over these vast alluvial fans, where a tiny change right at the top can redirect the whole flow. And then on the plains themselves, you've got multiple channels all competing for the same water. If you reinforce one, you can literally starve the others. So here's the crucial point. You don't have to build a dam the size of a mountain. The Himalayas, they provide the giant infrastructure. All ancient people would need to do is provide the bias, a little nudge in just the right spot, using a simple toolkit of stone, wood, and earth to tip the scales in favor of one channel over all the others. Okay, let's take a step back and put all the evidence on the table. It's really important to be clear about what the science tells us for sure and where the big questions still are. So the science is rock solid on a few key points. A real severe hydrological crisis did happen. The landscape was a mess of multiple competing river paths. And the path the Ganga flows on today, it's geologically pretty recent. And yes, those natural leverage points, they are real physical features you can go and see. But what we don't have is the smoking gun. No ancient tools found in a levee, no definitive structure that screams engineering. The geology gives us a plausible backdrop, but it doesn't give us the final proof of human hands at work. But this is where the story takes such a fascinating turn. When we take our geological map, with all its solid facts and its open questions, and we lay it over a completely different kind of record, an ancient cultural memory. So let's just boil down the geological story to its absolute essence. What have we learned? We know the stage was set by a time of immense environmental chaos. And we have the physical evidence of this chaos, a landscape just filled with competing unstable rivers, all fighting for the same Himalayan meltwater, which would have created absolute havoc for anyone trying to live on those plains. And finally, the geological record shows that out of all that multi-threaded chaos, one single dominant river corridor eventually won out, creating a stable, predictable, life-giving source of water where there had only been crisis before. Now, here's the reveal. That precise sequence of events, a crisis, a competition between many different paths, and the ultimate victory and stabilization of one great river, it aligns almost perfectly with one of the most ancient and foundational stories ever told in this part of the world. We're talking about the story of the descent of the river Ganga, as it's told in the oldest parts of the epic Ramayana. A story about a heavenly river that crashes to earth, breaking into countless chaotic streams, until a hero guides it into a single, life-giving channel. So let's be really clear. The ancient epic is obviously not a scientific paper. Of course not. But it's possible. It's just possible that it isn't just a myth. It might be a profound, poetic memory of a real environmental trauma and a real human-driven solution passed down through countless generations. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. What if our most enduring myths aren't just stories about gods and heroes? What if they're actually memories of our ancestors grappling with a changing planet? Stories written not in ink on paper, but in the very sand, silt, and clay of the land itself.